we wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending our presentation today and to the SNU team for having us come over and give this talk. We're really humbled and excited to talk about some of the work we did in the US regarding amplifying student voice during the pandemic last semester, and specifically touching base on interschool collaboration, letter writing, and media coverage. But before we begin, Grace, do you want to kick it off with some introductions?
Yeah. Hi, this is us, all of our nice Photoshop or headshots. But I'm Grace. I recently graduated from Rice University with a degree in material science and engineering, and I was the student body president my senior year, and I'm excited to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Raynon. I'm the second photo. My name is Raynon like the weather, and I use him, his pronouns. I'm the student body president for Washington University in St. Louis for this year, where I will be a sophomore majoring in political science and sociology. I'm very excited to be here.
And hi everyone, my name is Will. I served as the student body president at Brown University last year and recently graduated in the spring along with Grace. So quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we'll start with some background and outcomes regarding the advocacy and the campaign that we worked on last semester, and then detail the processes for how we organized everything, some of the lessons that we learned, then finish with next steps and opened up for questions after. So we hope this will be a helpful student perspective on what we can do to affect change given the state of the world right now. So I think with that, we'll go to Grace for background and outcomes.
And this is going to be very US-centric, but I think a lot of these issues probably matter for students all over the world. But what we were finding on all of our campuses was that COVID-19 was showcasing many inequities faced by US college students. We were hearing that students couldn't find safe places to work. Some had returned home to places without internet access, meaning they could not access their classes or had to have other arrangements, making it quite difficult to keep up. People were dealing with sick loved ones. People were watching family members pass away, loved ones suffer. And again, many of these home environments are not conducive to learning. There's a reason why we kind of have places to learn that are safe for us. And then finally, our international students were dealing with these very difficult time zones that made it really hard to keep up synchronously with their courses. And all these inequities were showing while schools were wavering in terms of their academic policies. So some schools were allowing for opt-in pass-fail, some were doing universal pass-fail. There wasn't really a system that was equal across the board. And so many students were worried about using the pass-fail, worried about their grades, worried about their futures, which during a pandemic, we shouldn't have to worry about our outcomes because, we're already dealing with the emotional weight of this crisis. And so a team of us, of student leaders, kind of got together and started to think about what we could do to advocate for these students, to agencies that had the power to ensure that students were taken care of during this crisis and they could use whatever grading system they needed to get by. So probably don't have time to read this right now, but this is kind of a several-page document that we put together and it went further into depth into the various items that I showcased. We talked about what students were wrestling with, and we talked about the critical issue of these unequal policies across many universities that were making many, many students anxious about their futures for different programs. And we curated this letter for grad associations, medical associations, their various US-based fellowships, to try and get them to realize that they had to be accepting of different grading policies because otherwise students were really going to really suffer from this crisis. And our letter, circulated online, and we got a lot of really amazing feedback. These slides are showing just all the universities that really came to the forefront to show their support for this letter. It was resounding to see a lot of people come up and say, yeah, our students are dealing with this, and we really need the support of these agencies. We really need to take action. And I think without this collective mobilization, it really would have been hard to gain the support that we did. And I will say, from my time in student government, this is probably one of the largest responses on one issue that I've ever seen. And I think it was incredible to see all these people come together to show their support for these grading policies. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Will to finish up.
Thanks, Grace. So, in addition to the advocacy we conducted with the student body presidents and universities to sign on in support of our letter, another big part of the campaign was working to influence and get the support of thought leaders in the education space. So, we sent our letter to prominent US based scholarship foundations such as the Fulbright Scholarship, the Churchill Scholarship, and then also focus some attention on these large consortiums of universities like the American Association of Community Colleges, the American Council on Education for the support. And we were really happy to find that these thought leaders in the education space were willing to not only endorse the recommendations that our coalition of student leaders put together, but then even issue statements that incorporated the recommendations to their member universities. And these are a couple of the statements we received from the groups that we reached out to. So the Rhodes Trust talked about how in their future selection process, they'll be accepting grades that are pass-fail without any negative weight or assumption. The American Association of American Universities really doubled down on ensuring flexibility. And then the Churchill Foundation actually added a question to their application to better understand the unique circumstances that students may face as a result of the pandemic. With process, I think, is that Rainin?
Yes, I'll be taking
talk
over.
about.
Thank you so much. So I want to start off by talking a bit more about the interschool collaboration that made this possible and why this is so significant. The goal of this project was obviously to ensure that schools from diverse backgrounds could work together and build a collective voice on an issue that, like Grace mentioned, really affected all of our students in the same way. So we met from leaders from HBCUs like Spelman, from big public universities in the United States, including the University of Michigan, the University of Pittsburgh, and the University of Oklahoma, private universities like Rice and Brown. We also met students from smaller liberal arts colleges, and being able to reach across all of these different colleges helped us build a collective voice that made us a lot more powerful and to really amplify the different struggles that students were going through. Some examples include the financial struggles of students during COVID-19. In the United States, for example, with so many people diagnosed with COVID-19, we've had 5.51 million people who have lost their jobs and 40 million people who are now exposed to eviction. So these financial struggles are disproportionately hurting low-income students at our schools, and trying to show how that would be a bigger concern than getting an A in a class was really, really significant and gave us the platform to do that. Secondly, was support for low-income international and BIPOC students. So groups of students who are marginalized on our campuses and were disproportionately being impacted by COVID-19, whether it be the health disparities that students were experiencing, the internal like familial problems or struggles that they were experiencing, or just financial concerns like we mentioned earlier. The third thing was academic instability, because as students were displaced from the universities and sent home, a lot of them experienced a lot of really negative impacts on their academics. For example, some students did not have strong access to Wi-Fi. Other students were not able to have quiet spaces where they could study or be able to access the virtual spaces and virtual classrooms. This made it really difficult for there to be educational parity and equity when we tried to transition to a virtual space. The last thing was about inequitable access to other academic resources as well, including books, all these other things that cost money and were disparately distributed among students in terms of access. This project was really important because it offered a stepping stone to create a coalition of student governments that were constantly in communication and specifically working on other issues that students across the United States were also being impacted by. Right now, Will and I are still working on that process and building up this coalition, but so far, since we've passed and sent out this letter in March, we've also worked on the Title IX changes from the United States Department of Education, which decreased protections for survivors of interpersonal violence on our campuses. We spoke and advocated for CARES Act funding with student governments at Cornell and at the University of Minnesota, which is about getting stimulus checks to college-age students who were excluded from the March 2020 stimulus payments. And we also talked about protections for international students, which is really important to us because the Trump administration in August tried to impose restrictions on immigration for international students coming back to the United States, preventing students from coming back to the US unless their classes were in person, even though it was incredibly dangerous and very irrational. We worked with some of the key actors involved, including Harvard and MIT, who ultimately successfully filed a lawsuit and were able to push back the international students ban. We continue to fight for things like asylum on campuses and protecting undocumented and DACA students. And in the future, we plan on working on even more issues that span across our campuses.
I can take this. So yeah, the letter writing process definitely was kind of how we started on the coalition that Rainin spoke about, because at that point we were just learning how do we work together when we don't know each other that well. We need to learn about each other's schools and we need to collaborate over Zoom. And so again, those initial leaders came together and we kind of just used our collective energy and voices to shape the content which is really cool to see all these people coming together, working on this letter, making sure that it was as robust as it could have been to make the impact that it had. And so the core team, which included myself, Will, Rainin, and a few others, really then kind of hammered down the messaging, solidified it after kind of the joint collaboration of the many student governments that we had to then decide how we could send it out. And we made sure at the end that we were compromising on different asks so we'd be feasible for associations to endorse, but strong enough to make impact. And I think that's a powerful statement for students is sometimes, you think like you're working towards a goal, but maybe it'll take some time to get there and you have to work with people who might not fully agree with your asks. And so it's important to find the middle ground where you can still be strong for the students that you support, but also working with people who have different needs on the table. And so we made sure that that was there. And I think that also helped us to be successful when we were collaborating with these larger organizations. So this is really the process we outlined. And I know it's now being made to be more robust by the student coalition that's forming of US student governments.
So the next section of the presentation, we wanted to touch a little bit on media outreach and what it looked like for this advocacy that we ran, and then how we could envision it happening in the future for other campaigns. So with our letter writing advocacy that happened in the spring, we were able to get coverage in a couple pretty high profile US publications, such as the Washington Post and Forbes, as well as specific education-based magazines such as Grad Edge and Diverse Education. And this was something we wanted to work on, not only to just raise general awareness of the issue, but also because we thought it'd be helpful in getting additional student body presidents and students to sign on to our letters and put some more national pressure onto universities and higher ed groups to make changes that would increase transparency and flexibility for students given the circumstance that they were faced with. So within the media plan that we created, our first step was to compile a contact list of all the different reporters that we wanted to reach out to. We made this Google spreadsheet and basically just put as many emails as we could in there. And then the next step was we created a website to direct visitors to in order to give them a quick overview of what our campaign was all about. So as you can see here, there's a quick blurb for what we were advocating for, and then it shows a live list of students, representatives who have signed on, as well as media that have covered our letters. And we did this in order to increase the legitimacy of our campaign and then also to spread awareness in an easily shareable format. So you can see here, one of the pages has the letter itself that talks about advocating for flexibility when it comes to grading and grading options in COVID. And then we also had a page that made it really easy for individual students, groups to endorse the letter, so they could just put in their contact information. And then we also had the other endorsements we received for them to read through. So once we were able to create the website, we then drafted this press release, which we sent out to the different media outlets and made sure to follow up with how we, the responses we were receiving, and then conducting any interviews that the media reached out to us about. And some of them were specifically looking for, let's say, students who were international or students who went to a historically Black university. So we made sure to connect them with folks who they would find most helpful. And then we shared the stories that were published afterwards. This is a bit of the outline for our change strategy. As Grace and Rainin mentioned before, we really focused early on getting support from student body presidents and student body leaders. We then took that support to these higher level education associations and coalitions to get their endorsements. And then the final piece of our change management strategy was to use the support of student body presidents and higher ed educations to then make an impact on the individual university level. So within each of these sections for outreach to student body presidents, we really tried to leverage our personal networks, asking friends who went to, let's say, Washington University as an example, to then see if they knew anyone who was on their student government. And then if someone was on their student government, who the president was, to make it a more personal connection, which we found to be a little bit more helpful than just cold emailing, let's say, the student government address. We also were strategic in the universities that we tried to target early on. So getting these larger and higher profile US universities, such as the University of California schools, state schools, Ivy League schools, that was helpful just to generate more attention from the media as well as from other university leaders, and then also allowed us to broaden out once we had their support. And something that we did, as I mentioned earlier, was keep a live list of the signatories and endorsers, so that way people could always keep track of who was signing on. Once we finished that section of our strategy, shifting over to the higher ed coalitions and scholarships, we utilized the connections that we have as student government leaders to our administrators to get them to introduce us to any folks they may know in higher ed organizations. For example, I was really fortunate in that the president of Brown, who I had worked with early in the semester, was a member of the American Association of Universities. So she was really helpful in creating that connection. And then we also made sure when we were reaching out to these universities to tailor the outreach so that it would be most relevant to their constituents. And then when we were talking about outreach again to individual universities, we created a template that would make it very easy for leaders to share with their administrators. Finally, some additional considerations and tips and tricks we picked up along the way. Again, leverage your school's resources for introductions to media publications. We utilized site builders such as Wix and Weebly to create our website, so it would look relatively professional with little coding experience. We used the websites LinkedIn and Hunter.io to find emails for reporters and members of these various academic associations, and then with our press release made sure to keep it short and also very publishable with quotes and an eye-catching title that would help drive media attention. And then, follow up on your leads as quickly as possible, and then don't be discouraged if your response rates are low. And then I think Rainan's going to talk about some of the next steps.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Will. Those are some really important items so that if we want to replicate this strategy, we can absolutely do so. Some next steps specifically in the movement for pass-fail grading are first, ensuring that equitable grading policies will continue for the upcoming semester. Like we've mentioned throughout this entire presentation, COVID-19 has impacted all of us in very disparate ways, and many students will still be displaced in the upcoming year. At my university, for example, around 30% of students are still in their own homes, whether it be abroad or in the United States. And that means that we're still not going to have equitable access to education, and thus should be much more flexible with our grading policies. We also have international students who are barred from entering the country if their school doesn't have in-person classes. And we also have a lack of resources for certain students, like low-income students on our campuses, who might still struggle today with access to things like Wi-Fi and proper technology. Second, we want to build up this coalition even further so we can address more of those issues in the future. For example, like we spoke about Title IX, international students. Our goal is to create this network for cross-school collaboration on a lot of these different issues, and to eventually become a potent political force that can work with national organizations to advocate for meaningful changes within and outside of higher education. In Canada, for example, the student governments have organized in a very effective way to create a national coalition that was able to push the Canadian federal government to end up allocating $7 billion towards students in terms of stimulus checks between the months of March and August. We want to one day become a force that will have that say in government and will be able to influence federal policies as well. And lastly is to institutionalize a focus on equity in higher education. Answering the question of how can we ensure that we serve all students instead of just wealthy and privileged students on our campuses, and create really inclusive campuses that engage in anti-racist activism that help to ensure that low-income students socioeconomically are able to feel at home here, and just in higher education in general, are able to access resources and Pell Grants and financial support and grants when they need them. And also integrating this advocacy into student governments in general and across the country, making sure that our work is not just with the administration, but specifically speaking on behalf of students, and sometimes pushing the administration when they do things wrong. Our long-term goal is that student voice will become an integrated part of college decision-making, and that administrators will see students as people who are very critical in making decisions instead of people who you can just go to for some advice or some insight. We want to become a voice that is respected and listened to. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we're happy to take some questions now.